Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Thanks for having us.
Good morning. How's it going?
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for having us all. Thank you all for coming and having the patience
So,
to weather this out.
yeah. Okay, so Jason, maybe I'll start with you for a second. There's one question that everyone in the room here wants to know. Was the Trump Middle East visit last week good for Israel or bad for Israel?
So I know there's a lot of confusion, and I think Congressman Mast probably described it really, really well as somebody who worked for President Trump for 23 years. I think it was a great visit. I know some people are upset that President Trump didn't visit Israel. Let's remember that the Prime Minister of Israel was in the White House twice already. I'm not bothered that the President didn't visit Israel. He had a certain agenda. His agenda was U.S. Gulf relations, U.S. economy. We have to, no matter how much we love Israel and support Israel, we have to take off our Israel supportive glasses when we deal with the United States of America and what the President's goals are and put on our U.S. glasses. And I think he had a successful trip. And I think, as President Trump said, his strengthening of ties with the Arab countries only helps Israel.
Okay. Dan, what's your take on
Speaker, just a couple of things because we have a very few minutes. I think I want to continue also Congressman Mast's moral clarity. And I think that everyone in this room understands that the world changed on October 7th in the sense that we woke up from willful blindness. And I want to lay down three principles that in Israel is very clear. JCFA just did a poll that showed that 78% of Jewish Israelis virulently oppose another Palestinian terror state in the hills over Ben Gurion Airport in Judea and Samaria.
Published by the Jerusalem Post.
What's that?
Published by the Jerusalem Post.
It was published by the Jerusalem Post. That is true, and it reflects three principles. Principle number one, we are facing jihad, not a political conflict. This is not a territorial conflict. This is, from the point of view of our enemies, a religious conflict. Arafat said it for decades. Hamas carried it out on October 7th. The second principle, before we get to President Trump, because I think this is a very important moment for Israel-U.S. relations, Jason. The second principle is that Israel is an indigenous member, the most indigenous member of the Arab Muslim majority Middle East today. The Middle East understands, and at JCFA we speak Arabic, we think Middle East and speak Middle East, and that is actually what President Trump did a week ago. He speaks Middle East. We must be speaking Middle East in Arabic to our neighbors, not in English and not in Hebrew, number two. Number three, the war that we all face right now, October 7th was an assault on the United States over the borders of Israel.
100%.
And it requires moral clarity, strategic clarity, and complete unity between Israel and the United States in order to defeat radical Islamic enemies. And it is not I who am saying this. If you look on your phones, not right now, because it would be fun if you just paid attention to this, but
please pay attention.
Or playing, what is that, Crush? What the game that people play?
Candy Crush is not popular
when people
anymore.
get bored.
I don't know.
Yeah, but if you look at what Foreign Minister of the UAE, whom you know quite well, Jason, said, he said this month that the biggest threat to the Middle East, not to Israel, but to the Middle East, is radical Islamic terrorism. And that is the spirit in which His Excellency, MBS Mohammed bin Salman, invited President Trump to the Middle East in order to lay down a new, innovative, what we call the economic shock and awe campaign, reminiscent of General Schwarzkopf, if you remember what happened back in 1991. But that was the point. It was not to snub Israel. It was to lay down a new line in the sand for the Gulf and the Middle East that says, get out your terrorists, which he said to the Syrians, and he said it. And
he called for normalization.
And he called for normalization, but he
Syria
didn't mention
Israel.
Israel's name. So those people that work for Reuters who don't understand the Middle East start talking about snubs. It's not about snubs. It's about being smart and culturally intelligent. Because one of the major mistakes that we have made in Israel and in the West is that we have failed to understand how political culture works in the Middle East. So we'll just open with those principles.
Okay, Jason, as Dan mentioned, that was a pretty good speech there. You don't need me.
It was a hog.
You don't need me. I could just go. Jason, so you were a special envoy for the first Trump administration, or as they call it, Trump 1.0. Do you actually see, everyone's looking at a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia? There's so much also misinformation out there, what the leaders want, don't want, why things are happening, not happening. Do you see it happening in the near future?
I don't see it happening in the immediate future just because October 7th, a horrific attack changed the equation. There is an Arab street, and the Arab street today is uncomfortable with what's happening in Gaza. And though we all recognize it's a necessity, this war was thrust upon Israel, and the Arabs themselves understand the necessity of Israel defending itself, it's not the time. But I do believe that under President Trump, something could happen. And you mentioned Syria, Dan. I do a lot of business in the Gulf, and this is the first time over the last year or so where I could hear my colleagues and friends from Lebanon talking about a future between Lebanon and Israel. A couple of years ago, Lebanon was slated to be the last, if ever, to sign an Abraham Accords or some sort of normalization agreement with Israel. Today, that's a possibility. They're talking about Syria. The world has changed so much, largely due to President Trump, both Trump 1.0 and now 2.0, and I think we need to embrace that and understand that. And I just want to add one more thing, and I fully agree with everything Dan said, and Trump speaks Middle East, if you will. But if you didn't watch President Trump's speech at the economic conference in Riyadh, I highly, highly recommend that you watch it. It sets out his goals, it sets out his policies, it speaks in very clear language what he wants to do. And I think back to the first time he went to Riyadh in May of 2017, when I cleared the speech that he gave. I didn't have to change a single thing. It was a perfect speech, but I remember marveling that he was going to speak about Israel in front of all the Muslim and Arab leaders. Well, here we are in 2025. The world has changed so much, and the way he spoke about Israel, the way he spoke about his support for Israel, the way he spoke about the horrors of October 7 and the necessity of what Israel is trying to do, it's really, really important.
Okay, I'm just going to ask people in the background to please be a bit quiet. Dan, the Oslo Accords, I think there's pretty much consensus, even people, by the way, who were part of the Oslo Accords, that it was a failure. So how do we, in the Oslo Accords, really institutionalize the term a two-state solution? Benny Gantz, who will speak here today, a few weeks ago said those who think a two-state solution is relevant or a Palestinian state is relevant are delusional. So what do you see, how do we move forward? What, because we don't hear from the government, our governments, or even any political party, what should Israel, in your opinion, how should Israel approach the day after in Gaza and Judea, Samaria, etc.?
The day after, Tzvika, the day after is right now. The day after was yesterday. And I think that empirically, we put out a book called Oslo at 30, now it's 32, Lessons Learned. And one of the greatest lessons we learned is that Oslo, in our view, was one of the greatest strategic catastrophes, maybe the greatest strategic catastrophe since the founding of the State of Israel. And the reason it is not because it offered a compromise solution, but because we actually inverted our own legitimacy with the PLO. And if you we understand what happened in the October 8th war in universities that every single person in this room attended. It was that the PLO and today the Hamas has become in large part in many circles the new Israel. And it's an awful thing that I'm saying. And that Israel is today considered the pre-October 7th Hamas. Why did that happen? Because at Oslo, we handed a Nobel Prize to Yasser Arafat. And Yasser Arafat then became the moral standard so that we could not act against terror because you were then acting against a Nobel Prize winner. We must reclaim the legitimacy argument now.
What's the approach now?
The approach now, we have an opportunity now to change the entire ideological, strategic battlefield. And on the ground, it means local control. That was the idea in the 70s. It was, the Middle East, as we all know here, is defined by families, clans, and tribes. The notion of Palestinian state is a Western idea. And we were superimposing that because we were, as Professor Bernard Lewis, the great Professor Bernard Lewis from Princeton, he said, the West mirrors itself, projects itself onto the Middle East. We must stop that and understand we must speak Middle East. We don't talk about ceasefires, we talk about hudnas. We don't talk about Palestinian statehood, we talk about security-first diplomacy, which means going back to the original family, clan, and tribe structure. And it has to be done quietly. No big ceremonies, no Pierre ballroom ceremonies for new peace processes, quiet, technical arrangements. That is what families, and having lived in Efrat, being your neighbor, having the honor of being your neighbor, Tzvika, for so many years.
Even though you left us.
And we go to our Arab neighbors all the time. And they're talking about,
There actually is coexistence.
there's even more. There's mutual honor, and they like being helped locally, and they're not talking about Palestinian statehood. They're asking to get green cards, if you will, to Israel or America. So they think locally. We should not superimpose a national Western idea on a Middle Eastern political culture. And there are solutions. There is one for Gaza. President Trump's vision is excellent.
Dan, just in short, and I want to give Jason another opportunity. You want to finish your sentence?
Yeah. No, Jason, what do you think about the Trump vision for...
So I think Dan raises a very important point, and as I was sitting at the table before I came on stage, I saw an article not in the Jerusalem Post.
I saw exactly what site you were looking at, and I was like,
Came across my
I
email.
don't know.
I don't know if the story is true, but apparently there's going to be a conference led by France for a Palestinian state. Let's understand why the Trump administration never used the word two-state solution. Lots of reasons, negotiation, etc. But one of the most important points I used to bring up is if a Palestinian state means that the Palestinians could attack Israel, how could you ever argue for a Palestinian state? And we never even imagined what happened on October 7th. We couldn't have imagined what happened on October 7th. So it's very, very important for everybody to understand that when France or others try to push for a two-state solution, that phrase means nothing. It's not implementable, it can't be done, and it's very important for everyone in the audience to explain why that is.
So, unfortunately, our time is up. Dr.
3 more minutes?
I don't know. I don't know. So, Dr. Dan Diker, Jason Greenblatt, thank you both for these interesting words. I think most of the people in the audience here pretty much agree with you. And Jason is not only a good diplomat, but he's a father of triplets. And I'm a father of twins. I can't even imagine. So, you know. So I think that's kudos to you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.